welcome to Invest Digital Health. My name is Orundhati Parmar, and I'm the editor-in-chief of MedCity News. Several years ago, we began hearing the term beyond the pill and the idea that the pharma industry needs to do more than just develop drugs. As a result, we heard of collaborations between pharma and digital health companies to do things like medication adherence. And then we started hearing about digital therapeutics and further collaborations between pharma and digital health companies on the therapeutic side. Those collaborations were largely a bust. If you've been reading our stories, you know how some of those collaborations have failed. But now the pandemic has proved to be a wind beneath the sails of pharma's digital reincarnation. And that is the subject of our discussion today, specifically on how pharma is leveraging real world data for this digital reincarnation. So I am pleased to share the fact that we have Arif Nathu, co-founder and CEO of Komodo Health, joining us to have this really interesting discussion. And I'm thankful to Komodo Health for sponsoring this session. So Arif has been co-founder and CEO at Komodo Health, and he oversees data sciences, engineering, and product development initiatives for the company. Arif has spent the last 15 years in healthcare and life sciences leadership roles. Before Komodo Health, Arif was a leader in McKinsey's healthcare practice, where he was responsible for helping enterprise healthcare address issues in corporate strategy, finance, sales and marketing, and organization building. Arif has conducted research in novel instructional technologies and medical devices with multiple publications in peer-reviewed journals. He graduated magna cum laude with highest honors from Harvard College with an AM in molecular and cellular biology, an MD from Harvard Medical School, and MPA in health policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome to you, Arif.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with a definition. Our audience is pretty sophisticated, but let's start with the definition of RWD. How do you define real world data?
Yeah, fantastic. Well, just want to start off by saying thank you to those of you who are on here and talking about real world data in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, or morning, depending on where you are in the world. I'm super passionate about real world data, and I think our company really focuses on what it does for healthcare. And just to use some definition to get us all kind of on the same page here, and real world data is what's generated outside of the clinical research setting. So that could be from your visits to the doctor, to your electronic health records, to wearables, to other kind of at-home sensors, and to information you may fill out on a survey. So it's information that we collect after the research is done to how any product, any intervention is used in the real world setting.
So perfect. Talk a little bit about data generated outside clinical trials, as you said. We talked about this as we were planning for this session, Arif, and I remembered how your reaction to my question made me feel like I'm so old school. So I'm going to repeat the question. I was thinking that the way you achieve good outcomes is if all this data sitting outside of the electronic health record being generated by so many different devices and systems gets integrated into the EHR. But you said, no, that's not it. Why not? Please explain to us.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, so we've been thinking about the role of the EHR as this massive data collection engine that's going to kind of integrate all these great pieces of information about us. And I think the way that the world has really evolved is that data is being generated in thousands of different ways and different formats. So you may have like a wearable device that's generating sensor information, and nobody's sitting there saying, oh, I really wish I could go to my doctor and download the sensor information and put it into my EHR. That is like a word that is stated by pretty much no one. And so the problem right now is that from a data viability standpoint, we generate data in so many ways. And yet the way that we access it and who accesses it tends to maybe see a sliver of everything that's generated. This is where we say, well, we've got two basic solutions. Either we believe that everything will make its way to the EHR, or we kind of believe the world is moving to this fully digital kind of cloud native world where data is being generated in many different places. And it's our job to figure out how to find it and link it to something that we can use to kind of get a true sense of that patient journey. And so I tend to believe the latter. I tend to believe that the EHR is just one of many sources of information. It's particularly important in hospital-based conditions, but that our future is going to have permutations of many different data sources being generated daily from so many places. So that's the world that I think we're moving towards, and what I believe is that future.
So I've been schooled. Okay.
This is the opinion of one person. Let me make it clear. Right? That's great.
If data is being generated in so many different areas and there is no one repository, where do patients go to get the information? I mean, we used to have this old concept of the personal health record that failed spectacularly. No one really used it. Microsoft Vault shut down. Google stopped its own PHR. But I feel like it's coming back with companies like Citizen and another company called Seekster. So, how do patients even know where to go to get the wealth of all these different records? Is it really necessary? If pharma is the industry that's gathering up all this data to develop drugs and targeting these populations, do patients really need to care about where their data is?
Yeah, I mean, so remember 15, 20 years ago, before we had like Mint, and you think about your financials that's sitting in like 15 different banks and credit cards and so on and so forth. And the personal aggregator is, not only a business model that has helped, kind of industry get a better handle of how people think about their own personal balance sheets, but it's created an ability for you to build and track and manage your own finances and do it, with a bunch of integrations to lots of different places. Now, we are kind of like in the early days of health, right? I mean, we see the PHR, the personal health record, being used by certain people who are fanatics about, kind of their own self, or if they have massively chronic conditions that require, really important transportability of that information between one provider and another. And so there are motivations already for people to do that. But generally speaking, a lot of us are not doing that. And we sort of ask ourselves, well, why do we do that? Well, personal finances are important to us on a day-to-day basis. And so you see that like the willingness to go do that. But when someone is not sick, that willingness to go and aggregate your personal health record, unless you're doing it for other reasons, is just not there. And so what is the incentive to drive that behavior? I think that's really where we start. Now, when someone gets sick, they wish they had that. And so that's really when we start thinking about the question of, well, how do we make it so easy and seamless for them to grab their data, use it, and manage it? So, what we're finding is that it's not going to be these big health tech players that have a massive conflict of interest between their responsibility to their advertising business and kind of their core business that are going to lead the way. We see companies like Picnic Health, for example, or Citizen, as you mentioned, that was recently acquired by Invitae, to really kind of pull the data in for people who are really excited about that. And so we think about that possibility of kind of first-party data entering the system where people can choose, like Picnic does, to share that data for research purposes as really the kind of way that we're moving. But we have to start seeing the incentives and the reason to kind of get your PHR step up to start really see widespread adoption.
Okay, let's move to the pharma world, which is what we're here for today. How much of a culture change do we need to see pharma have to start to see the importance of RWD? And I think that's happening. I mean, they've been very focused on clinical trials and clinical trial data, but of course, we don't live in the clinical trial world day to day. So what are you seeing in terms of a culture change within pharma?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, for years, pharma has basically thought about let me go figure out which doctors are prescribing lots of branded medications, and then let me just send lots and lots of reps there. And so that's really been the way that real world data was used. It was basically tracking the pill, figuring out how the pill was distributed. Now, if we think about the world where we really need to understand the patient, the journey, their evolution, where they are in the treatment process, all of a sudden, your world goes from being very provider pill oriented to really being patient oriented. I think many pharma companies are not really prepared for that transition. Their systems are all based on the provider and kind of detailing that provider. They track by the provider, and we stop starting to think about the patient. And so now we're in a world where the patient really is the focus. And so for a lot of them, it's an evolution of that thinking. Now, they are absolutely bought in to the importance of real world data. I think the challenge is parsing that from all the different streams of patient information, being able to link that into complete journeys and be able to do something about it that actually helps patients. That's where we're seeing the need.
Arif, we have about 100 people in the room, so I'm going to ask them to help me in asking you questions. So instead of waiting for Q&A at the end, folks, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and then Arif and I can tackle them as we see fit. Okay, so let's talk about a pharma company developing a drug for, say, kidney cancer. How does real world data inform the decisions that they make?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it really starts with the patient. So, what does the population need in terms of better treatment? When we think about something like kidney cancer, standard of care has actually improved dramatically over the last 20 years. Mortality rates have dropped. In fact, if you survive kidney cancer for at least 5 years, you're more likely to die of heart disease, right? So this is a condition where, there's been massive progress. At the same time, there's still enormous burden of disease for metastatic kidney cancer, especially among Black and Latinx populations. So, that's where I would start. I would start by looking at where the disease burden is being felt, where's the standard of care lacking. And when companies do that upfront, they actually move through the development and commercialization process a lot better. Oftentimes, these things are disconnected. We're just going to go recruit the study, we're going to focus on that, and then we're not really pulling through the insights. So we would start there. Now, imagine we do have a drug candidate that actually addresses unmet need. Then I kind of look at my trial footprint, and then I look at where the disease burden is, and then we compare that. And chances are we'll find that less than 10% of eligible patients are actually being given access to the study. They're not screened, they're not notified. And that really is what we have to change. That's where I think a lot of companies will say, if we really understood where they were, if we understood the pathways to getting to a provider that's in our study, or basically at a site that is that we've already been recruiting at, we can actually make a meaningful difference in offering patients a chance to get therapy that could save their life. And so that's really what we focus on, which is helping them see those patterns, helping them understand where those needs are, and helping them really think about that differently than they have been today.
Do you have any anecdote, like an example to share of how they had certain preconceived notions, and then just looking at the data that you were able to provide changed their minds on the population that they were serving or the market they thought they had?
Yeah, I mean, we see this every day. I mean, take this trial example. We've been working with so many products in late stage clinical trials, and we had one, for example, that had only enrolled maybe 10 patients in 18 months, and the trial's massively behind. It was for post-transplantation blood cancer, and using our healthcare map, using our instruments, our insights, we're able to identify about 75 patient candidates in 3 months and get them screened, get them moving through the trial. And the trial ended up finishing recruiting early. And to us, that is the true testament of using real world data to influence an outcome, right? I mean, we have certain parameters on the trial. We see certain things that may predict whether a patient is transversing through the system, not being given access to that study, and we're able to close that gap and make that happen.
Mm-hmm. So someone has read my mind. Let's talk about clinical trials. I can tell you anecdotally, we accept contributed content from folks. And in the last 6 months, I've had multiple contributions to the point where I'm saying, I don't want to cover this topic anymore, about decentralized clinical trials, the idea that you can run them virtually. So I'll let you share more on how you think clinical trials is going to evolve in the future.
I mean, I believe in the power of decentralized trials. I believe in the belief that we can find patients where they're at. We can meet them where they're at. We can make the experience of working or of being enrolled in a clinical trial easier. I think the machinery, though, is still biased towards a traditional CRO model, and I don't see that changing for a long time. And so I think the question for us is, how do we take the current infrastructure, which has a certain bias on the study sites that pharma is using based on the particular CRO they've picked, and then how do we find a way to get those patients to those studies? And so I think, a very different model is not decentralized trial, but essentially more effective centralized trials, which are how do we path patients through that process? Once the patient's in the trial, I do believe that decentralized machinery makes it easy for them to stay in the trial, for us to collect more data on how they're doing, for us to have and create essentially a better patient experience through that process. And so we're going to see a lot of innovation really come to bear on that. But I do believe these systems are going to be working together for the foreseeable future, which means the entire data ecosystem that fuels those decisions has to work together as well.
So I'm going to draw on some personal experience. My brother had metastatic kidney cancer and died a few years ago. And I was one of the people who, in charge of sort of driving him to clinical trials and things like that. So one of those clinical trials required him to go to Stanford and get an infusion for about half an hour, 45 minutes. How do you make that decentralized? How do you make that? Is it possible?
Therein lies the problem. But if you think about the nature of the infusion clinic, a standalone infusion clinic that is growing, and there are these infusion clinic networks that are growing across the US, we're seeing that maybe that could be 5 or 10 minutes away from your brother. And, in that experience of just being able to go to a clinic with a nurse that knows that, who can get the drug supply for the study, whatever that is, to basically make the infusion, that whole supply chain has to work. So for us to actually see this come to life, it's not just that we can create an easier site that's right next to you, create a better user experience, which is possible. We have to think about the supply chain. We have to think about the appropriateness of training and of the folks who are in there. We have to reimagine the entire ability to address care. And I think just to the point that you made, that's why this is going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. We're not going to, everyone lauds the hey, decentralized trials are here, but the entire infrastructure has to support that. And we're not there yet. For conditions that can be diagnosed and treated over a phone, absolutely. We're seeing that evolution happen, and COVID accelerated that. But for what you're describing, for disease that really requires the expertise and the care, it's going to take that time for us to kind of reshape the ecosystem to make that happen.
I'm also curious about clinical trial diversity. Are you seeing pharma industry feel the urge or feel the necessity of actually finding ways to reach more and different people? Is clinical trials the way? Is RWD the way to get there? How do you get there?
Well, first of all, companies need to make it a priority. And if you really believe in that, then you're bringing on folks who really understand how to diversify the patient base in trials. That means you're making those hires of diversity leads, diversity for clinical trial leads that are bringing that expertise and knowledge to the team. We've looked across the industry. Some companies are absolutely making those hires and bringing those folks in, and others are not. And so you start by putting your resources where your mouth is on how important that is. And number two, you have to really start thinking about what are those barriers to access. And we love to believe that, for example, real world data or decentralized trials closes gaps in care. And I would argue that absolutely does not. Because the data that we see is reinforced by essentially a healthier and wealthier insured population. So the data alone isn't going to actually change how you're behaving and increase that diversity. Decentralization alone, when people don't have access to an iPhone, is really not going to, by itself, change the way that we work. So we have to make a commitment to diversity by understanding the barriers to access, understanding the social milieu of a patient, understanding the challenges they may face in getting to trial sites, understanding why their doctors may not be recommending a trial for them. Once we start conquering those behavioral challenges, then I think you start seeing a pickup in that pace. And we've seen that happen with certain companies that have made that commitment, but not, without that being deliberate, without that being the focus, without that being part of the recruitment process end to end, we won't see a change.
Okay, so we have a question from the audience asking you to be a little more specific. So the question is, Merck recently had an entirely digital trial deploying a range of digital tools, including apps and wearables. Can you speak to what digital technologies you are seeing actually being adopted? So you got to name some names here, Arif. Not yours. Anyone?
Well, let me just start by saying this is 100% where the ecosystem is going. So we've got remote patient monitoring sensors that are evolving, but every trial is different, right? So if I need, like if I need an EEG in a clinical trial that I can access remotely, I'm going to go to a new company called Beacon Biosignals, right? I mean, they basically have remote sensors for EEGs that they're tracking, they're creating a device, a consumer experience that makes it easy to collect that information, and then machine learning on that EEG information. Really great example of one company solving one problem. And if we start thinking about that for a condition, every single trial needs a different set of things that they're monitoring. And it's based on the drug, it's based on the category. And so I would encourage, a trial when they're starting up to start thinking about like, what's all the sources of data that I need to be able to do that. The second place we're seeing a lot of innovation is on patient-reported outcomes, really easy stuff to collect. We collect it in an app, we collect it in a questionnaire. How do we actually do that at scale? And so in our mind, what we're observing is that kind of the traditional kind of quality measure type of collection of that data has migrated from paper to iPhone. Great. How do you create that in a more consumer-friendly interface? And so we're seeing a lot of other companies try to evolve that. Again, where patient-reported outcomes are an important part of that trial. Where I see studies failing is not in like running these studies that use remote monitoring and sensors and PROs. It's actually in the collection and utilization of that data, structuring it, linking it, all to the same patient token, being able to perform analytics on it, whether identified or de-identified analytics. That's where we see companies making a miss. So it's one thing to kind of get all these data streams. It's quite another to actually, use them, study them, and then pull them through. And I think that's really where the systems have to evolve. Because right now it's, kind of a clinical trial site by trial site that collects the data into an old school system that's really not keeping up with the pace of data change.
There's another question. I wonder if the person wanted to say patient-centered or patient-reported data, but the question is, how can we share patient-centered data to make a more equitable system work for everyone?
So this is a really important part of the challenge today, right? Because if we operate, so we have two worlds that we operate in. We either operate in the HIPAA de-identified world where data is fully de-identified and certified that it's de-identified under HIPAA, or we work in the fully identified world where first parties consent to having their data shared for research, right? So if I think about just a very simple feature that we could collect data on, like race and ethnicity of a patient. And certain folks track that. There are certain data sets that track that. If we operate in the de-identified world and we just link race and ethnicity data to a kind of basic schema of information on that patient, likely we will have to suppress other information to make that data valuable. And so this is a challenge in the de-identified world, which is how much information can we preserve which still protects privacy. And this to me is the number one challenge when we kind of work in the de-identified world of adding really important social contexts to that data set. And so we've seen a lot of companies evolve data sets to kind of say, hey, we've got really important information on the social characteristics of the patient. But the challenge is, can we safely link that to kind of cost and outcomes data? Can we link that to provider and facility information, things that are actually really relevant? And can we do that at scale? And so this becomes an important balance between, HIPAA and privacy. But if you can solve that structural problem, if you can develop a framework to bring in social context, to bring in race and ethnicity and other features of a patient that would be really important to making better predictions, you can actually make a lot of impact by doing that. And we're finding ways to do that at scale. And we're really excited about the use of real world data to do that.
So I want to go back right to the beginning where you talked about so many different kinds of sources of data and so many different places where the data is sitting. I feel like interoperability is a big part of the RWD discussion. So have we gone where we need to go? Are we making progress? Where do we need to be? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's great because you asked me things I have a controversial view on. So we've talked about interoperability for years, and I think it's like the easiest out for what is effectively a fundamental truth in healthcare, which is that there's no trust between healthcare organizations. Every actor looks at it as a zero-sum game. If I'm a payer, it's money from the provider I'm taking. If I'm a pharma company, it's making sure that I'm getting my fair share versus the insurer. There's this trust that just breaks down because they see the same pie and they say I'm all competing for the same dollar. So if anyone says, oh, interoperability is this big challenge, I'm like, no, just convince 20 people to actually share data that come from payers, providers, and life sciences company and put it all into a little pool that they can all access. And you have essentially, you'd be able to solve the interoperability problems, but nobody's willing to do that. And I think that's really where we see the biggest opportunity and kind of why we developed this thesis that if we could build a ground truth of healthcare, what we call this healthcare map, we can use that to study outcomes at scale. And it requires a lot of folks who inherently don't trust each other to share that data. But I believe that we have standards, we have quality, we have the ability to structure unstructured data using AI and machine learning. All of the infrastructure in the cloud has gotten to the point where we can do this at scale, processing billions of transactions in minutes and hours versus weeks. And I think that whole transition has made interoperability taking that off the table and now putting it to people to say, what are you going to do to improve patient outcomes? Are you going to share data? Are you going to contribute? How do you do that in a way that will protect your business, but at the same time advance outcomes? And so I think that's really the conversation we're taking across the industry today.
So again, a question from the audience. How do you think blockchain-enabled platforms answer some of the interoperability problems? I feel like blockchain was so hyped. I don't know that it has really panned out.
Yeah, I mean, we have to ask ourselves where a public ledger, where that transparency really matters. And so if we think about, for example, first-party consents and sharing data, having a blockchain solution really makes sense there. If I'm thinking about tokenizing de-identified data and linking them across other sources, blockchain's not a solution. So I think one of the important conversations we need to have is where does a ledger type of model play a role in healthcare? And we've seen incredible success in creating transparency vehicles through blockchain. And so we would suggest that if folks are thinking about blockchain interventions, they focus on problems of transparency, where there has to be visibility and representation of a transaction to enable trust between parties. So when we see problems of distributed analytics, when we see problems where people actually need visibility into consents, blockchain can play a huge role in bringing that to life. But it doesn't solve all problems. And I agree with your point that we tend to we throw the term around, and often it's not the perfect solution for some of the interoperability problems we're having.
Okay, now let's talk about Komodo Health. What is your stake in RWD? What are some of the capabilities that you guys have?
Yeah, I mean, as a company, we believe the only way to really address unmet patient needs, to close gaps in care, to streamline provider engagement is through a real deep understanding of real-world data. So we start by kind of collecting healthcare costs and outcomes across the population. We call it the healthcare map. It's visibility into complete patient encounters. And we pair that up with software that converts the real world data to real world insights. And in our mind, half the problem is kind of assembling, collecting, cleaning, linking. And then the other half of the problem, or where we think the value is created, is by actually doing something with it, finding that need, being able to pinpoint that in a population. So we build a lot of tooling and services that allow us to create great software and perform great analytics at scale off of that data.
Okay. I think you said that your first companies were in the life sciences, and now you're looking at payers and providers as well. But just let's focus on life sciences, given our discussion today. How have their data needs changed pre and post? Well, I shouldn't say post, pre-peak and post-vaccine pandemic, I guess.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we think that if you look at the pharmaceutical industry as a whole, they've historically suffered from inertia. Kind of the old way of doing things was fine. I can go send a rep to a provider, we can have a conversation. I have a whole bunch of services on the back end, from a MSL or a medical service that provides a scientific literature and thinking, all the way to patient services that I can operate for the patient. But my primary vehicle for education is still the rep. And I think what we found in the pandemic is that it just blew away a lot of assumptions around that. We had to understand where were offices shutting down, where were providers, how were providers delivering care to patients. And so we saw this massive adoption of digital solutions, including ours, to basically address very fundamental questions about what's happening to the healthcare system. And this is pre-vaccine, post-open, because there have been opens and reclosures and reopens and reclosures again, and basically understanding disease burden patterns. Where are patients getting tested? Where are they not? And we were seeing that whole kind of reimagination of the pharmaceutical engagement model. Now, fast forward 5 years from now, the whole patient experience is changing. The whole value changing. How patients get screened for disease is happening virtually. How they're getting presented options, that's happening through AI and chatbots just as much as it's happening through doctors. How they get their at-home testing kits and how they read those results. And then potentially even get their drugs delivered from their local pharmacy via an Uber. So this is a whole change to the way that we think about healthcare. That reimagined value chain, that's really where pharma is, I would say, struggling because their infrastructure is not built for that. And so they're running around doing pilots on different parts of the value chain, but really trying to think deeply about integrating that end-to-end experience of the patient into how they engage at decision moments for that patient, whether it's through the provider or through a chatbot. That is a fundamental shift for life sciences. And so we were seeing that change happen. And our kind of role in all of that is to think about the platform by which we start to see all of these different events and help companies intervene in a more timely and accurate way to enable better patient outcomes.
So believe it or not, you do have competitors, right? So you have Aetion that's in the RWD world working with pharma. You have more traditional companies like Optum, IQVIA. Why would pharma companies want to work with you?
Yeah, so there are so many approaches to addressing population health. And the companies you mentioned, some of them are applications that really say, hey, we want to focus on validated research. And Aetion is a phenomenal example of a company that does great validated research through their application. Other companies you mentioned are data providers, and they basically say, here are all the ingredients, we aggregate them, and we hand them over to you. And so what we've basically determined is that one of the missing gaps between the data and the actual thing that you do on the data is building that insight stack. And so that's effectively what we focused on, is building all of the tooling so we can partner with anyone. We can bring any other data set into our environment. We can build and run our algorithms against them. We can create software experiences, or we can partner with others that have a phenomenal software experience to use that to create great outcomes. And so we stopped looking at the world as like these companies compete with us to saying every company out there should be partnered with us. And so that is a fundamental difference in the way we operate our business versus others. We're open to linking everyone's data in. We're open to using any other software on our platform. And we think that that creates both scalability, interoperability, and value for a lot of our clients. So yeah, it's a great time to kind of be thinking about this because these ecosystems are evolving and changing basically by the week.
It's funny you mentioned about collaboration and competition. Yesterday, I pre-recorded a session with Microsoft and Google. We're going to make it live tomorrow. And they were like, well, we were fierce competitors, but we worked together in this and that. I think the pandemic has changed. I don't want to sound like this is a kumbaya moment, but I think some of the traditional rivalries have been muted because we're in such a crisis. Let's switch gears a little bit. There are a few questions regarding the role of pharmacies in the world of pharma. So Amazon is moving boldly into this space. So many other retailers are also in this space. What's their value? Can they help patients improve their medication adherence? What do you think?
100%. And the pharmacist is such an instrumental, trusted partner to the patient that what's so fascinating, and we've seen this kind of in the evolution of new pharmacy delivery services or kind of virtual telehealth visits where we distribute drugs directly to the patient. Oftentimes the patient will receive that drug, but then they'll have a question, they'll give their pharmacist a call, and the pharmacist was cut out of the actual process of giving the patient the drug. And then on the other hand, they're the ones that are going to pick up the pieces. And so I think one of the biggest challenges for life sciences companies is that historically their view into the pharmacist is sort of biased by the type of data they receive. So if they get data from certain pharmacies, they over-index on those pharmacies being the ones that are important, and then they focus on partnering with them. What we have to really think about is the way that the patient receives the drug, the way that their experience is with the pharmacist. And I'll tell you that there's a massive change and shift in how that's happening with a lot of direct delivery to the patient. Where is the pharmacist in that process? Should that pharmacist be available for a virtual engagement? at any point when they get their drug. How do we bring them more into the process to help the patient utilize the drug appropriately? I think because those conversations are being cut out, we're going to have a reimagining of the way that a pharmacist should be engaging folks. And I think pharma needs to be able to see that. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges right now, is that unless you're really bringing data in from the payer point of view, where they're seeing all of these different interactions happening, you're going to be missing out on a lot of those engagements and opportunities to influence the patient for the better.
This is interesting what you said. I forget whether it was Aetna. I think that it was, but don't quote me on it, where they had was it Aetna or was it CVS Health? I think, well, now they're the same company. What's wrong with me? So I think it was them, where they were partnering with the retail locations where people come to pick up their medications. And they were partnering with community organizations to fulfill their social determinants of health needs. I thought that was a fabulous example of how you can leverage retail pharmacies into solving problems that have a direct impact on outcomes. What's your sort of comment on that? Do you see more of those?
I totally agree. And I think if you're a pharmacist or part of a large chain like a CVS or your Walgreens, like finding a way to engage the patient using your network is a huge opportunity. So how are you engaging them virtually? How are you supporting the delivery of the medication to their house? Are you supporting them when they come back into the community setting? I'm seeing, though, a lot of the pharmacies are starting to get disintermediated. So now imagine an Amazon kind of delivery vehicle. You don't even talk to a pharmacist in the process. But how do you make that pharmacist available to the patient? I worry about that, because I feel like that loss of connection is a chance to, address patient need. Now, are we compensating by having more virtual channels? Are we compensating by telling patients where they can go? I think there's an opportunity for us to think about that, but I'm really glad to hear examples of our large retail pharmacy chains actually reimagining the way they actually engage patients. So I think that's a step in the right direction, but we still need to figure out what happens to a lot of folks who are now leaving the kind of traditional retail pharmacy system for direct delivery.
Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about digital health companies trying to get in front of pharma. Are they seeing a more amenable year? Is pharma more open to working with digital health companies? And then secondarily, I'm asking two questions in one go. I feel like they don't talk the same language, the pharma world and the digital health world. In fact, there's a new accelerator in Boston that's been created to basically connect
the two together, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So kind of like, men are from Mars, women from Venus, kind of that situation. So what was your personal experience in working with pharma? How did you get them to crack open the door for you?
That's a great question. I think the most important thing for a digital health company is to really make sure you're addressing an unmet need for your customers. So our customers in the early days of Komodo were medical affairs teams that were using lots and lots of publicly available data to figure out which physicians were shaping treatment pathways at an institution or providing the kind of leading insight. And one of the things that we realized was that there was no patient level data in the conversation. Nobody was understanding how the patient moved through the system. And these predictions were all based on how much they published or which presentations and symposia they were showing up at. When we added a patient lens, we found a fundamentally different answer on who actually drove decision-making in healthcare. And so we built basically network models to prove that out. And we solved a pain point in a very clinical condition for our client. One of our earliest clients was multiple sclerosis, and it's a very clinical disease. And so understanding how patients pass through the system is a far better predictor of provider relevance than how many publications they have. And so we were addressing a very specific need. We at first they were like, well, we don't want to buy software. Just give us, just tell us the answer. And so we said, sure, we'll tell you the answer. And we're going to provide a little piece of software for you that if you want to share the answer with the team, it's a little bit easier than Excel. Okay, so we got them to start using that. And so it was a change of behavior that took us basically years to start driving essentially software adoption among folks who were pretty much like, hey, I consume all my information in PowerPoint and Excel. Why do I want to use your software? And that to us, understanding the change management in that, meeting the client where they were, not forcing my tooling, my business model, my way of working on them, but saying, look, I understand how you operate. let's figure out a way to make this easy for you. And by the way, let me show you something that you've never seen before, and you tell me what you think. And so that's how we kind of got to a place where we could really drive that change. But digital health companies need to think about that deeply. Many of them just go in and try to impose a way of working that doesn't fit for a lot of our pharma clients.
That's what I've heard too, is that they're solving a big problem. And so they think that, I think there has to be a way to not just reinvent the wheel all the time, but fit into that workflow. I think this is true for providers too. So again, I'm going to urge the audience to ask more questions. I'm rapidly running out of questions, so feel free to jump in. I also wanted to talk about policy.
Yeah.
And it's a sensitive topic, but we're certainly going to be seeing some healthcare policy that's coming down the pike, whether it be more price transparency, better access, or even drug pricing. What's your stake in this? What do you, as CEO of Komodo Health, want?
What I want is better access to patients and more equitability and distribution of care across the ecosystem in the U.S. The U.S. is an incredibly robust innovation engine, and there are definitely haves and have-nots in the healthcare system. And if we think about the power of a new therapy or the power of a new intervention to save the life or address disease burden for a patient who is lost in the healthcare system, to me, there's nothing better than the power of data to do that. When we work in conditions like sickle cell disease, we're finding patients who drop out of the system early, who are not even making it to Medicare or Medicaid enrollment and coming off, and they're showing up in the emergency room with a VOC, and that's bad for the patient. And so if we can kind of use data to identify those opportunities, we can have a tremendous impact on patients. So what do I think about the policies coming down the road? Well, drug pricing, that changes. It's going to force our clients to be far more efficient in the way they deploy resources. They're going to have to get smarter about that. And we think that could potentially lead to reduced patient pay, or it could not. And I think there's a lot of research on both sides to suggest that it will or will not have an impact on out-of-pocket costs for patients. And I mean, we've seen research argue it both ways. So I'm not going to wade into my personal beliefs on that. But in terms of a lot of the focus on transparency, I think we've seen a lot of pushback on transparency. And again, if we move to far more push forward on transparency, we think that that's ultimately great for ourselves, for the healthcare ecosystem, because it takes the mystery out of it, and we can actually start really focusing on where that unmet need is and drive a solution there. So I tend to believe that these changes, whether they're positive or not for a certain actor in the healthcare system, if we think about this from a patient lens, a lot of them are designed with the patient in mind. Let's make sure they actually contribute to a better patient outcome. And that's what we'll be looking for strongly in the way that we use the information.
Yeah, I mean, it is a contentious topic, no doubt. No doubt. If you ask the pharma, they're going to be like, "Oh, this hurts innovation." But of course, their marketing budgets are so much higher than their R&D budgets. So maybe the marketing budget can come down a little bit.
Listen, I'm not going to debate that. I am the beneficiary of marketing budget, so let's. But I agree with you. I think there's a lot of waste, and I think there's a lot of opportunity. Everyone's looking for ways to drive value for their patients, to find patients, to address their needs. And look, we spend lots and lots of money doing that, because at the end of the day, like, that's really what drives the company, but that's also what drives better patient outcomes that we can prove. And the beautiful thing about RWD is that it's transparent. Healthcare costs and outcomes are transparent. I can know every patient on therapy 1 versus 2. We can track them longitudinally. We can make a statement about whether they're positive in one situation, the other are positive in both. And this is really important information for everyone. It's important to create transparency around it. I don't think teams are there yet, because value-based care is, again, another one of those great terms that we bandy about, but haven't figured out how to put at a systematic level that we do see progress being made in little niches. And it's like, how do we find the places to drive that better? So absolutely. Yeah, agreed with you on that front.
Okay. There's a question on specialty pharmacy here. Is there any specific anecdote that, or if you can share, for a specialty pharmacy from a business operations and tech perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing the rise. I mean, so it's very interesting the way that we think about specialty drug distribution. So there's been evolution, obviously, in basically manufacturing and supply chain on that front. But what we see a big gap in, and opportunistically, is how specialty pharmacies use data to drive a either better experience for the patient or empower and enable pharmaceutical companies to better understand that. So historically, a lot of the SPs have a whole business selling services back to pharma company. I'm going to give you data on these patients. I'm going to provide some stream of information on who got the drug, when, and how. But the problem of that is that they only see their drug distributed through that one channel. They miss often the context of what's happening around them. Are other patients getting drugs through different provider networks or different SP networks? What happened to that patient? How did that patient come to you? What were they on before? Are they brand new diagnosed? And so there are all these insights that SPs as a function are missing from essentially the conversation with pharma. So they end up working with data aggregators that link all these feeds together and then basically shift it over to pharma and say, here's the dump of data, enjoy it. And this is a problem. Like if I were thinking about reshaping the SP, I would be thinking about deeply understanding the patients that are coming. I'd understand why they're coming. I'd understand their experience. I would want to parlay that to really deeper insights on the patient journey for life sciences companies and have a much more holistic discussion about patients coming on and off versus thinking of myself as just, a delivery vehicle of the drug. And I think that is a shift that we haven't seen all SPs take in hold. We have some on the innovative end that are really doing an incredible job rethinking about the system, but many of them are just kind of drug A to drug from point A to point B, and how do I do that efficiently? And so I think that change will create winners and losers, and we're seeing it already in the ones that we talk to. Innovators are deeply interested in what's happening to the patient before and after they acquire a drug. And laggards are really just thinking about themselves in terms of distribution.
Another question about digital in pharma. Firms like Livongo, Gluco, and Welldoc are effectively into disease management, especially for diabetes. A majority of their patients are using pharmaceutical products during their care. Do you think pharmacists and digital tools for pharmacists and patients to manage medication are being given appropriate attention in these solutions?
That's a great question. I'm not sure that they are. I definitely think that the belief that we can replace what is a fundamentally human experience with an AI-driven one works in some cases, but not in others. And so we really miss out on something I said earlier, which are all the social cues that help us understand what the patient really needs. And in some cases, they need a coach. In some cases, they need a pharmacist. In some cases, they just need the information that's being provided to them via the engine. But a lot of times, the tech multiple and the tech margins are all driven by how much I can automate. And so we're trying to automate out an inherently human experience rather than saying, how do I enable that human to have a more efficient engagement with the individual? And so if I were to think about the role of pharmacists and medication disease management and sort of the more sophisticated ways that we think about, addressing outcomes, we have to find ways to bring them back in, and we have to find ways to make them more efficient and more equipped to have a more holistic conversation versus, a couple like, hey, can I click a button on a chatbot to make this more efficient and faster experience? That's not really necessarily addressing the patient need. How are we listening to them? How are we getting them paired with the right person? How are we getting them the right conversation to happen? We can use technology to improve that without taking people away from the experience.
So a follow-up on that, my sense was that some of these solutions, including that of Komodo Health, do involve humans like coaches, nutritional coaches. So these solutions are not completely negating the human side, right?
They aren't. And I think what's beautiful about, the company you mentioned, Amada, is that they really are finding the right balance. But the challenge is that, oftentimes if you're a health plan that offers Amada, you get this email that says, join the Amada platform. Like, how many people click on that? Does everyone click on that? Is that the way that they want information? How do we integrate these into the way we engage people better? And so I think there's a little bit of the challenge of getting someone to start engaging the service, and then discovering that there are a lot of folks that are involved in the process and it's very tailored to your experience. So how do we better identify what your needs are? How do we identify, like, get to you, reach you as a person and say, hey, we've got this thing for you. Here's how it's going to help you. And then create an incentive for you to join it. I think that's really where there's a lot of research and a lot of work being done, but we have to get that formula right. And I don't think it is, because engagement rates when people are on the platform tend to be good. And we're seeing for chronic diseases with patients who are severe, absolutely. But we want to catch people pre-diabetic, and we want to catch people where lifestyle and diet changes, which are not therapeutic in nature, can actually change someone's course of disease. How do we get there earlier? How do we do more screening up front? How do we find services to help folks? I feel like that's really where there's still a lot of untapped opportunity. Not to say people aren't working on it, they are, but there's still massive untapped opportunity would actually suggest that.
Okay. So someone wants you to describe your startup experience. So I guess it's fundraising, it's banging on people's doors. So go ahead.
So we're, just to give you a sense of our journey, we're now in year 8. We just celebrated our 7th year anniversary of Komodo, which was in September. And we're a team of now over 600 people. And I started the business with my co-founder, Webb Sun, amazing individual. And it was 2 of us in the basement in September of 2014. And the process of going from 2 people to hundreds is a journey. And I would say for anyone, the experience has its ups and downs. I have loved, growing every week, every month, every moment with a new experience. But I will say that kind of the early stages is all about, do I have something? Can I build something? Is there, how do I build something? And kind of stage now that we're at is how do I really share the message and scale this where I know it's really working? And so I would tell folks, no matter where you are in the journey, you're kind of pre-funding, before your seed investment, all the way to folks who are multiple rounds of funding, and really thinking about your customer, really understanding what they need. To me, there's been no better truth for Komodo than to really be clear about that and to really focus on the value we create, because if you are doing that and you figure out how to capture your appropriate share of revenue for that value, you will do well. And I think when we see businesses that are at different stages of scale, and when I think about my own experience, I just had to keep myself focused on that. And that kind of carried us through many years of growth, and hopefully many more as we continue to scale the company.
Wait, but your story didn't have any information on, writing a business plan on a napkin and getting millions.
Yeah, I know. Taking that napkin and you're like, oh, we're going to change the world with this. Well, we did that on day 1 in the San Mateo Public Library. We love to joke about this. We wrote our list of everything that we loved about our past experiences and hated about our past experiences. We wrote Komodo's 4 core values on that whiteboard that day, and they're the same values that we are, 7+ years into the business. That is a truism of all businesses, I think, that are built for scale and for the right culture. But our moment was when we had an investor that said, how long have the 2 of you known each other? We're like 6 months, we're 6 months into this journey. And this is week 3 of Komodo. He's like, before I invest, I want you to write your vows to each other. And I was like, what do you mean our vows? He's like, I want you to write your vows. I want you to tell me what you commit to doing for Webb. I want Webb to say what he commits to doing for you, and show me that a year from now, you won't have taken my money, spent it all, and not be talking to each other. And I want to save these, because when your company goes public, I want to give them back to you and show you what you committed to each other and ask you whether you live to them to this day. And I would say 7 years later, I don't remember actually what I wrote 7 years ago. I'm getting old. But I will tell you that my partnership with my co-founder and our ability to build a successful business is really predicated on both of us sharing the same values, working really well together, and building a company and culture that we can be proud of. So that's something.
You're almost getting married, right?
It is a marriage. As our wives will joke, we talk to each other more than we talk to them over the course of a given week. So we are definitely married in one form or another.
What about your investors? Can you name who they are? How much you raised over the years?
For sure. So, we announced our Series E recently, which was led by Tiger Capital and Caston Capital. It was a $200+ million round. We were fortunate to be surrounded by phenomenal investors. In addition to Tiger and Caston, we have Andreessen Horowitz, Iconic, IA Ventures, Felicis, and McKesson. So amazing investors that have helped us over the years and given us everything from great advice to tough love to capital to help us continue to scale our ambition.
How do you negotiate? I shouldn't say negotiate. How do you navigate different types of investors, like strategics versus traditional VCs?
It's a great question. I tend to believe that you need to know what your exit criteria are for a stage. So when we were raising our seed, we wrote a document called our Series A hypothesis document. So which was like, in order for us to raise a Series A, what do we want to see? And that document, we actually negotiated with the VC, which was IA Ventures, that we took the seed funding from, to make sure that we were 100% aligned on what kind of business we were building. That exercise alone and the back and forth we went through with the investor taught us how they operate. And it was massively instructive. A lot of people don't take the time to do this. They go pitch to 20 people, they'll get multiple term sheets and they'll pick the one they liked. I'm like, I don't care if you like an investor or don't like an investor. What's the value you have to create in your business to kind of get to the next stage? And yes, liking people goes a really long way, but it's not the be all and end all of like a relationship that you're building with an investor. And so at every stage, we updated that document. We looked at how we fared. Some things we did well, some things we did poorly. And then the next one, and then the next one. And at every stage, we were constantly pushing that forward to make sure we really understood, and they really understood the same truths about the market and what Komodo was doing that would be different and more valuable for patients.
Okay. In other words, don't think as a startup founder and CEO that your investors really know nothing about the market, right? You don't want to think that.
Sometimes they do. I will be honest. We know more than our investors, but I'm paid to know more than my investors. That's my job. My job is to know more about my market, to build a better product than what exists out there, to drive the use of that product, and then to provide a phenomenal return for my investors. That is my job. And some investors want to be market owners and knowledgeable around that. That's great. Others are saying, I want a return. Others are saying, I love my founders and I want to help them succeed. And others are saying, I love this market and I want to be a part of it. There's so many reasons to invest. And, we meet an investor where they're at. We understand why they are, funding Komodo the way they're funding it. And that's a decision. And so we need to understand our investor base to be successful in our job. But every investor has a different reason for existence. And I think we love that. We love that about them.
So I want to bring the conversation back to pharma. If there's one thing you want pharma to achieve in 2022, I know there are many, but one from your perspective, what would that be?
That's a great question. Rethink equity through the lens of the patient. And my push to pharma is that every system, from CRM to kind of the way you engage the market, is provider driven. Where's the patient? Get to the patient truth. Build out a way of thinking about patients at scale. And if you do that, if you accomplish that this coming year, you will be set up for the next 10 years. That's my one piece of advice for every pharma company out there.
Okay, we have a minute left and I'm always curious about names of startup companies. So why Komodo of all things?
Well, every Greek and Roman god and goddess appending the word health to them was already taken in 2014. But my less flippant answer is that in every story and every fable, there's always this proverbial dragon that sits between the person and what they're trying to conquer. And we think that dragons are misunderstood. They're feared instead of being revered, and people don't understand them. And so we were we want to harness the magic of the dragon, the fire, the passion, the excitement, and apply it to a hard problem. And so we named ourselves after the Komodo dragon, the last living dragon, which is now endangered. So I really hope we're able to keep the population of Komodo dragons alive, and at some level also carry the spirit of what they represent.
Well, I was born in the year of the dragon, so I will take that answer.
That's fantastic.
Arif, thank you so much. This was a fun discussion on a very serious topic, and we kept it light, and I hope we got some important thoughts across. Again, thank you for sponsoring. Thank you for taking the time. I wanted
course.
to mention there was a question from the audience. All the recordings of every session will be available to attendees. After the conference, we will process the videos and send you guys links. So you will be able to hear this great chat again.